There we go. From the beginning. Okay, do you now see the slideshow?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So we're going to talk about bonsai as energy management and how we're going to be looking at everything we do with bonsai is basically managing energy. So one of the things, the benefits of knowing what I'm going to be teaching you is huge in that if you are able to follow this and understand it, you're going to have fewer dead trees, you're going to have healthier trees, and you're going to have more refined trees. And where we're going to begin, we're going to start with the roots because when a seed grows, the very first thing that puts out of the shell is the root because the root has to absorb water to give nutrients to the cotyledons. And roots dictate the amount of foliage that a plant will have, and that's true in bonsai as well. So where does the energy come from? Most of us tend to think we fertilize our trees and that's where all the energy comes from, when in fact we all know really that it's photosynthesis. Sunlight stimulates chlorophyll in the leaves. The leaves have absorbed water. When it stimulates the chlorophyll, it breaks the water up into hydrogen and oxygen. It combines with carbon and it forms C6H12O6, which is glucose, which is the storage, which is the energy available for trees to grow. So we're going to use solar panel analogy and a battery analogy as a way of understanding plants. So the solar panels are the foliage. So the leaves, the needles, the scales, they're the structures that absorb energy or absorb sunlight and create energy. The battery we're going to say is the root ball, and the battery, the size of the pot and the type of soil will impact how much energy it can accumulate. The bigger the pot, the bigger the battery. The better quality of soil, the better roots in there, the bigger the battery. So what impacts the energy accumulation of a tree? Basically how large the foliage is and how much there is. The more foliage, the more energy it can accumulate. Also the angle and placement and availability to sun. The more sun exposure these solar panels have, the more energy that they can create. So if you're in shade or they're shaded out, they don't do as well. The age of the leaves also has an impact on how much energy they absorb. Brand new foliage, when it's brand new, just coming out, actually absorbs no energy. Until a cuticle forms on the leaf is, if you will, taking energy away from the battery and not giving anything back. Now, newer foliage that has cuticles will start to absorb sunlight, will photosynthesize, and they're very efficient, and they're more efficient than the older, in this case, pines. So new needles that have hardened off are more efficient than old needles, but both contribute to the energy absorption of a tree. Now we're going to talk about impacts of energy accumulation and distribution. The smaller the battery, or in this case, the smaller the pot, the less capacity it has to accumulate energy. Also, the more unopened panels or the more buds that we have set up on a tree that have been created, and to which a limited amount of energy is going to flow, the smaller the panels. So more panels, and you have 100 units of energy going to 500 panels versus 1,000. The 500 panels will be bigger, the 1,000 will be less. And then also sun exposure. So trees return resources to branches that are efficient and accumulating energy, and they tend to discard branches that do not. So one of the things we want to do, want to have a limited amount of energy to a lot of buds, which will then create smaller internodes and smaller foliage. The holy grail in bonsai is refinement. That basically the smaller foliage or the smaller needles or leaves, the shorter internodes, and they're sitting on a well-designed structure that creates the illusion of a tree in miniature. As I told you, this presentation was based on Peter Warren, who's a bonsai professional in England, and he describes bonsai as the generation and redistribution of energy to achieve aesthetically pleasing form. So growing a tree in a large pot makes refinement of branches, foliage, and internodes length very difficult, if not impossible. So remember, it is the small pot that makes bonsai bonsai. And we could try to do it in larger pots. It would be much more difficult because the roots wouldn't get restricted. So what are the things that we can do to manipulate the trees? We want to manipulate either how much energy they accumulate or how they distribute that energy. And all of the things, almost everything we do in bonsai is to either either increase or decrease energy and distribute the energy within the tree. So before manipulating these things, we need to assess the energy status of our trees. So if you have an existing tree, that's one way to do it. And if you have a newly acquired tree, that's another way. So for an existing tree, you want to know, when did you last repot it? So if it's been if it was last year, you know that its energy and ability to distribute its energy is very good. So that's a good sign of it has energy available. Health and the amount of root system at repot. Was this repot severe or mild? If the repot's severe, it's not going to have as much ability to distribute that energy. If it was mild, it will. Also, the one thing you want to notice is how much root was left with respect to the canopy. So if you have a lot, if the root matches pretty much the canopy, you're pretty good. If you've lost a lot of root relative to a big canopy, it's going to take longer and it's not going to be as energetic. Also, the health and the size of the canopy, the more foliage on top, the more energy it has to help recover. How vigorous was last year's growth? That's also a sign of how healthy your tree is. And did you fertilize it a lot or a little in the fall? So if you're anticipating a root prune in the spring, then oftentimes you may have given extra energy and extra fertilizer in the fall to anticipate that. Now, assessing energy in a newly acquired tree, we want to look at the quality and amount of foliage. In other words, we don't have a history. We can't go back and find out what happened. Also, for instance, one of the things, if you get a juniper and it's not really growing very much, the new tips, but you get crotch growth, that's usually telling you your juniper's struggling and doesn't have a good root system to sustain what it has and is trying to survive. Also, you want to look at the number and size of buds on the tree when you get it. Obviously, the more buds and the bigger the buds, the more energy it has. Also, you want to look with the location. Are the buds on the tips, or are they also on inner branches? If you have buds on inner branches, that's telling you the tree had extra energy to give buds in that growth. You also want to look, like, for instance, pine trees and spruce. What was the length of the previous year's growth? That will give you an idea of how well it grew the previous year. And also the last thing is on pine trees, or spruce for that matter, you want to look to see if they have second year growth. In other words, I was going to repot one of my pine trees, but all of the second year needles fell off late fall.
Oh, that's not good.
That basically told me something was going on. The tree didn't have enough energy to keep those going as well as the new ones, so it dropped the second year growth and kept the new ones. But normally it should have both. Next, after you assess what energy status your tree is in, the other thing we need to know is what time of year is it. Is this a good time to repot? Is it a good time to prune, wire, bend, fertilize, trunk chop, different things? That will have a significant impact on what we're going to do. Here's a hypothetical energy growth curve for a normal tree. Can you see my cursor?
No.
Okay. Well, if you start in January, January, those are the months across the bottom, and the units are 100, 200, 300. These are just hypothetical energy units that a tree might have at the beginning of the year. So in January, it has 100 units. February, nothing's happened, still 100 units. In May, the tree starts to grow. It's starting to put out solar panels. Those solar panels aren't reaccumulating energy. And as a result, the tree starts going in an energy negative position, meaning it's having less energy than when it started. And it will, the more it puts out, until those, the cuticles start to form and they photosynthesize, the tree is giving up energy at that point. However, once those cuticles start to form, the more that form, the tree now starts to accumulate energy. And you can see over the course from approximately May on, it starts to grow and grow and grow. It sort of maxes out in October, November, when we get to fall, when leaves turn color. And now the tree is up to 200 units of energy, so it's ready to get bigger next year. If you look at the hypothetical energy growth year for a bonsai, what you can see is everything's normal until about April, May, when we start pruning, when we start, cutting back branches and things like that. And you can see what happens is the energy goes down, it might start to go up, and maybe then we come in and do a partial defoliation or cut back a lot of branches. And what happens is the energy for the tree goes down. And then after we've done all these operations and leave the tree sit and recover in the later part of the year, it starts to accumulate energy. Obviously, it accumulates a whole lot less energy than a tree that was untampered with or uncut or unpruned. And the goal would be to get to 120. Now, if I got to 100, which is on the thing there, that means the tree didn't gain anything, and in fact that's not a good sign. So your tree's always going to get a little bit bigger or a little bit thicker, and you want to make sure that there's always just a little bit more at the end of the year than there was at the beginning. And again, you're not going to measure it, you'll just know by the health of the tree. So what season do we begin? We're going to start in the fall, because basically that's when seeds are formed and ready to go, and that's a rudimentary tree. So we could start at any time, but I'm going to start in the fall. In fall, our leaves are turning colors. Needles are starting to take on winter color because the tree starts to reabsorb minerals and nutrients. And the tree at this point in time is trying to accumulate and store as much sugars and starches as it can for next year's growth. It's also going to balance the sugars and starches throughout the cells of the system. And the more sugar in the tree, the more antifreeze it has and the more winter tolerant it is. That's why we don't want to be cutting trees late in the year when they're trying to store energy, and now we've just interfered with that. So the tree right now is in an energy positive state, meaning it has more energy than it did in the spring. But the metabolic activity at this time is slowing down. A tree cannot heal itself at this time if we cut it, and it can't compartmentalize wounds. So at this point in time, we're not going to do a whole lot. But what we can do is at leaf fall. Leaf fall is a time in the year. Leaves initially will turn color, and then after the tree starts reabsorbing them, sooner or later those leaves will start to fall off and they'll crinkle and dry up. And when 70 to 80% of them have fallen off or whatever, we consider leaf fall. And at this time, we could, with deciduous tree, do some light pruning of tips and light wiring. We can also, this is also, you want to, again, leave the leaves on the tree almost till the end because it's absorbing minerals and nutrients, which is helping the tree gain energy. Then we go into winter dormancy. In winter dormancy, there is some metabolism going on with trees, even though it's minor. Occasionally, there's some photosynthesis occurring. Sometimes trees actually can photosynthesize through the bark. So trees during the winter phase will continue to accumulate winter hardiness until winter solstice. They are in an energy positive state, and they have minimal metabolic activity going on. Dormancy, what can we do at that time? Basically nothing. Keep your trees protected, make sure the wind isn't blowing on them, and they're, and basically as protected as you can. Late winter, early spring is when things are, which is sort of where we are right now. We're just breaking dormancy. Bud swell is occurring. We're starting to see, in a little while, we'll start to see leaves flushing out, and we'll actually start to see the leaves. And what's happening with the tree at this point in time, it's using its energy from stored resources, but it's not returning anything back to the tree. So if the tree had 100 units at the beginning, it may be down to 70 or 80 units when those leaves start coming out, and they're not photosynthesizing. So it started energy positive, the tree's beginning to use energy, it's going to go negative, and so it's less than where it was. The other thing that's happening, though, metabolically, the activity is starting to ramp up in the tree. So that's a good sign. So late winter, early spring, if a tree had a good year, it accumulated a lot of energy, and it's energy positive, we can do major root pruning at bud swell, and we can do it until the buds open. So we don't have to do it exact moment of the bud swelling, because that process can take days, sometimes weeks, depending on the weather. And as long as that bud still hasn't opened up, that's a great time to continue to repot. But once they've opened, good time to stop. The other thing we can do, if we aren't going to do major root pruning, is we can do major wiring and styling and pruning and things at that point in time with a lot of the trees. Now, the exception to doing one or the other, because you can either major root prune or major wire and style, would be if you purchase some nursery material that was deciduous and it would grew really well. It is possible that you could do some heavy root pruning on that, as well as heavy top pruning, and the tree would probably handle that. So that would be an exception. Some other late winter, early spring things. If you didn't root prune, we could have significant branch removal. We can do large damaging bends. Terry Monroe will be doing a presentation next week at our Thursday meeting on large branch bends. We could do trunk wedge cuts, and they work reliably on young pines. Young doesn't mean 5-year-old pines, probably less than 40 or 50 years old would probably be young. And we can rewound scars at this time. Also, the thing to remember is one major operation in a season. If you're going to do heavy root pruning, don't do heavy top unless with that exception that I gave you. And if you want to do heavy styling, don't do the root pruning beforehand. And also do not perform major repot or major styling with branch removal or major bends. Energy that the tree has at this time, when you do those things, the tree has to take time to heal and recover. When is a tree ready for the next operation? When the tree is healthy and it can sustain and add foliage. So if you do a repot and the tree stays healthy but doesn't add very much, it's probably not a time to do another activity. But if it grows and it continues to grow and add a lot more, that would be a sign that you're ready. You could potentially do the next operation within that year. So if we do the repot in the spring and the tree really is vigorously growing, in summer we could do the second operation. Some other things, what do we do with fertilization? Fertilize only when metabolic activity begins. So fertilizing through the winter when things are dormant is wasting fertilizer. And it's probably also not good to be sitting in the pot because it acts as a salt. But basically, you can begin to fertilize when buds swell. Excuse me. If you do repot, a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks, because it takes about that long for roots to heal themselves and then to begin to regenerate. But at the same time, I wouldn't just say 4 to 6 weeks. You want to see vigorous growth occurring to know that the roots have recovered. And so the roots must be able to show that they can sustain the foliage that the tree had, and they can also add on. When they do that, the tree is telling you that the roots have recovered. Trees don't need fertilizer. Damaged roots are not helped with fertilizer because fertilizer functions like a salt in the soil and may cause water to leave root cells to balance out the concentration gradient. So no one has ever killed a tree by not fertilizing it quick enough, but you can kill a tree if you either over fertilize or fertilize too quickly. So I always recommend err on the side of waiting to fertilize following a repot. Some other things with late winter, early spring, maintain a healthy balance of oxygen and water with a little more oxygen than normal, especially when you've repotted. So if you've repotted a tree and it's sitting outside and there's a lot of rain post repot, I would put that tree under a roof to let more oxygen in the roots. Normally you wouldn't have to do anything, but if you get day after day, rain, that's not going to help the roots heal. When we get to mid-spring, that new growth that has come out, we're going to start see the early growth that first came out harden off first. So the first 2 leaves that came out will harden off before the next set and the next set and the next set, but that will occur in a progression. So typically, when we see about 4 to 6 leaves, some energy is beginning to return to the tree because they're now photosynthesizing and bring energy back. The tree's probably still in a negative state, but it is in the process of reaccumulating, and the tree is metabolically active, so it's high activity. So do we fertilize at this time or not? Again, as long as the tree's vigorous and showing growth, we can. Whether you fertilize or not depends on a number of issues, and we're not going to go into them all today. Maybe Terry, when he has his Q&A, can address those questions specifically. And that will be Thursday, the following week after our meeting. Or no, not Thursday. Anyways, I'll get to what that is. I think it's the 25th. Anyways, it's a Friday. So one of the things we don't tend to do in the spring is fertilize long-needled pines, such as white pines, because when you fertilize those, the needles tend to extend, and our goal is not to have long needles. So we oftentimes will wait until the needles harden off with white pines to fertilize. The exceptions to that would be like a Japanese black pine or a Japanese red pine, where we will fertilize very strong in the spring because we want the tree to get really healthy, have a lot of energy, because we're going to cut all those candles off in approximately mid-June. And now that tree is going to have to push out a whole nother set of buds and shoots and needles, and it won't have nearly as much time to elongate and harden off. And so that would be an exception where we're fertilizing long needle pines not excessively, but a lot, to encourage a lot of growth, knowing what we're going to do later. For maples, for instance, opposing leaf trees, oftentimes as the first set of leaves come out, which will be opposing leaves, the next set that comes out in between them, we're often pinching them very quickly to stop the elongation, basically you stop that branch from getting longer and force new branches to come out where the leaves are, so we get bifurcation. This also stimulates inner buds, so we can continue to do that as long as the tree keeps pushing out buds from the center of the two leaves. Now, again, some individuals will fertilize a lot when they do this, and then they pinch a lot. Some people don't fertilize at all in the spring and still pinch. Some people partially defoliate and do supplemental fertilizer. And everybody has slightly different strategies to this, and you have to sort of get to know, you have to try a few and see which works best for you. Mid-spring, I'm going to, things we can still be working on some things, but we tend not to style junipers. As junipers start to elongate, we know that the cambium, which is the, basically it's a one cell layer of cells that divides the xylem from the phloem, and the cambium basically creates the xylem as well as the phloem and increases it. But basically the cambium and the xylem are not well attached when the needles or scale of juniper start to grow, and if you start to wire and bend them and you're not really good at your technique, you can detach those and cause branches to die. Styling of other trees is still possible at this time. You could still style and wire trees, but you better be very on point with your wiring, because now all the new solar panels are out and you have all the foliage in the way. So obviously we would best to have been wired in the spring prior to foliage. However, if you're going to partially defoliate, that may give you another time to go back in and rewire, because a lot of the foliage won't be there. And you're going to be wiring at your own risk, because new growth is incredibly delicate. Some mid-spring activities with pines, such as single flush short needle, such as a Scots and a Mugo pine. We're going to be pinching the candles. The candles will be elongating, and we're assuming the tree's in refinement. And once that candle looks like it's elongating outside of the silhouette of the needles, then we're going to pinch that candle basically back to the silhouette that we want with the needles. After we do that, the first round we go around pinching all our candles. We're going to check it on a daily basis to see which candles start to extend beyond the silhouette, because what will happen is the pinching will reduce some of the energy, but it mostly redistributes the energy. So by pinching a candle, now the tree's going to push its energy into other candles that are, say, moderate size, and they'll start to grow. You'll pinch those. The tree still has a lot of energy, and then it pushes more energy into the weaker ones. So if you do this on a regular basis, you can get a balance in your needle length and your shoot length with those, and you're redistributing the energy. So during this time is a good time to pinch, and don't think if you've done it once, the one day you're done. You've got to keep after the tree until the tree stops, elongating those candles. Late spring, post-flush hardening. This is the time that, again, this is beyond 4 to 6 leaves. A tree later on in the spring, early summer has started to harden off a lot, and it's put out a lot of foliage. Cuticles have formed on the needles. They formed on the leaves. The tree is now darker green, and the needles are firmly attached. So these are ways to know that in this case, a pine has reached post-flush hardening. If you try to tug at the needle and it stays on the stem they're darker green, they're sharp, and their cuticles are formed, that's when post-flush hardening has occurred. On white pines, the one thing that's the same thing, but they have sheaths on their shoots that they put out. When you start seeing them falls off, which is sometime in June, you know the tree is now hardened off and is ready for some of the techniques we are going to apply. Again, at this time, the tree is energy positive and it has a lot of metabolic activity going on. So trees have reaccumulated energy as new foliage is efficiently photosynthesizing. Old needles, though less efficient, also contribute. So leave your old needles on. If you are going to wire and things like that, I would still try to leave some of them on rather than plucking them all off. Post-flush hardened pruning, again, late spring, early summer. The purpose of this is to reduce and redistribute energy. For instance, a deciduous tree, you may cut your branches that elongated. If it's an alternating tree like an elm, you may cut it back to 2 buds because you're looking to get bifurcation. Pines or other elongating species, if you missed your pinching opportunities and it is now hardened off, this is your chance to correct by shoot pruning. In other words, you carefully go in and let's say your candle elongated to a shoot that's 3 inches long and you wanted that shoot an inch long. So you could go back in and cut it back to 1 inch, try not to damage the needles that you're going to be leaving at the end. And the tree now has time to set buds where you have pruned that shoot. Most pines and elongating species have shoots that can be cut now and they will form buds at that cut site. Post-flush hardened pruning and defoliation, late spring, early summer. Make sure the tree's energy positive when you do this, and did it grow vigorously, and add is telling you then it's ready for a lot of these things. When we do the pruning and defoliation, we're reducing energy that the tree has, and we're also redistributing energy. So for instance, I tend to be a fan of partial defoliation, and when you partially defoliate a tree, you need to do at least about 70% or so. If you do less than that, you may not stimulate the tree to compensate, and it may not put out a second growth, and it may say, well, you know what, I still got enough, I can handle this. However, when you remove about 70% of your foliage, the tree has not realizes, I'm anthropomorphizing here, but the tree basically appreciates it doesn't have, if you will, enough sugar starch production, so it will put out second set of panels, or in a pine tree, it will start setting buds, knowing it has to compensate and have sugar starch production because it doesn't have it anymore. So the other thing that can happen when you also defoliate or prune, you're giving inner branches a chance to get sun and inner buds, etc. And as a result, you're going to encourage inner growth, which oftentimes we want, especially in bonsai. This may be a time, and should be, to consider adding supplemental nutrition, some fertilizer, if you've done some partial defoliation, because you've really weakened the tree and you're going to give it some energy to put some back. Full defoliation, if you're interested in that, Walter Paul promotes that, and he uses that a lot. And my understanding is basically he is very heavily fertilizing, and he does partial defoliation and finds it very successful in his working with trees. I've killed trees with full defoliation, so I tend to stay away from it. Early summer, again, it's an energy positive state for the tree, high metabolic activity, again, assuming that, you know, after you partially defoliated, it came back again. It is possible that you can partially defoliate very vigorous trees, such as trident maple, sometimes 2, maybe 3 times a year if they have enough energy in them. But anyways, early summer, you can do major branch removal if you didn't partially defoliate. You can wire and style now trees because they're the shoots and the buds and the needles have hardened off and are not nearly as delicate as they once were. Also, when you partially defoliate, it's just easy to get in and wire those trees. You can also, in early summer, rewound scars. A scar that isn't healing and rolling as well, you can go in there with a sharp blade and very carefully cut the inside edges of the scar, and that will, since vascular growth is going to start soon, that will add to the scar and increase rollover of that scar. So at this time, the tree still has a lot of energy, and it has time to heal and reaccumulate solar panels and get energy before the first hard freeze. Also, there's still enough daylight length for trees to put out more foliage to compensate for what was removed. When it gets really hot in the summer, sometimes it can get so hot summer dormancy can occur. This is still an energy positive state for the tree, but the tree metabolically might slow down when it gets hot, especially like 90 plus degrees. So the tree sort of is existing without doing a whole lot. And if it gets over 90, you may not necessarily want to fertilize. For one thing, the tree's not doing anything with it anyway, and it can act, like I said, as a salt in the soil. And there's generally not a whole lot of things you're going to do in the summer for most trees. However, this is a time, and I don't know a whole lot about tropicals, but I do know a lot of people repot their figs and probably some other tropicals in mid-heat. And if you have questions about that, I don't know very much about that, but Terry may be able to answer some of those questions. And we have PK, I think he's somebody who is in the club who does a lot with tropicals. Also, junipers generally like heat, especially rigida. And rigida you can begin to do major work with them at this time. And overall, junipers and pines still can usually be handled and managed during pretty hot weather. Also, when you're doing this, consider the pot size. If you've really forced the tree into a tiny pot, you might be a little more careful about what you decide to do at this time. For the other trees, things like alpine trees, or subalpine, such as spruce, fir, larch, hemlocks, things like that. These are trees that you're going to want to give a break from the intense heat, especially probably after 12 o'clock. When it's really hot and the sun's baking them, it can kill the trees. They can get sunburn, etc. Basically, they don't have the capacity to be able to transpire enough to keep them hydrated. Azalea would be another example of a tree that couldn't handle intense sun, and a lot of deciduous trees, again, in bonsai pots cannot handle some of the intense days of August and September. So consider partial shade cloth, and or keeping them out of the hot sun after about noon or so. Late summer, early fall, again, this is an energy positive time. The tree's metabolically active. Shorter daylight length will trigger the shift to vascular growth. So in the spring, the tree is much more into foliage growth, and in the fall, it's increasing vascular tissue. So it's going to be expanding its roots. It's going to be expanding its girth in terms of xylem. Phloem is also going to be increasing, and bark is also going to be added onto the tree. The tree is setting up its highways to be able to take care of the solar panels it's creating and going to have for next spring. So it's thickening up and getting ready to be able to do all that transportation. So this is a time we're not going to be removing solar panels. We're not going to be doing a lot of work on taking lots of foliage off on our tree, especially 4 to 6 weeks before major frost. We can take light things off, but we don't want to be taking a lot because the tree won't have time for the new foliage to grow, to harden off, accumulate energy. So major styling of conifers you could still do if you're leaving a lot of foliage on it. If you remove a significant amount of foliage, you'll need to protect it and probably keep it in a greenhouse type environment. This is also the time, late summer, early fall, you should be checking your wire daily because I've gone a couple days and didn't see it, and it's amazing sometimes how quickly the trunk or a branch will thicken up and the wire will bite in. And if you have a smooth bark tree like a maple that you're trying to keep it scarless, in a very short period of time, that scarless tree can have lots of scars. And you're going to know that your tree's going to expand its girth, especially if you let it grow a lot. So if there's the more leaves that grew or the more needles or whatever, the thickening is going to increase. So what are your basic goals with energy? Is either you're going to try to generate energy. So we do that by letting the tree grow and have as many panels as possible. We fertilize more frequently, or we use larger amounts of fertilizer, and we make sure that weak branches are exposed to the south or the best sun to maintain their health. Why would you want more energy? Well, if you're going to be planning for a repot in the spring, you're going to do major branch removal, major styling. You want the tree as healthy as possible, so you may ramp up energy by giving them more fertilizer. As I talked earlier, if you're going to be decandling your long needle pines like the Japanese black pine or the Japanese red pine, you're going to kick up a lot of, you're going to put on a lot more fertilizer up until the time that you do that, and then you're going to back off so you get the smaller candles. You also may want to do this before partial defoliation, and if you're somebody who likes to do a lot of full defoliations, then you're going to want a lot of energy so the tree can recover from that. The other thing that we want to do with energy is we want to redistribute it. Why do we want to redistribute our energy? We want to send energy to the weak areas of the tree to maintain a balance and avoid apical dominant growth, and basically have balanced density across the canopy. So we want sort of the number of needles at the top of the tree. If there's, I'm going to make this up, if there's 25 per shoot at the top, we want 25 per shoot. Nobody's going to be counting, and that's where the needle pinching works out. But the idea is you want to have density across the tree, not just with needles, but as well as with your leaves. This also, we can encourage inner growth to replace outer growth when we're trying to redistribute energy. So pinching is pushing it in, or defoliation can also push it in. So we're trying to encourage inner growth to replace some of the outer growth we may need to get rid of. And we do this again by pinching and pruning. Japanese black pines, we will needle pluck after we can do that in the early spring. We can go back and leave, I'm going to make like 15 pairs of needles on every branch, so the amount of energy going to that branch is equal. We don't want to, and you're trying to balance the weakest branches with the others by the needle plucking. So you pluck the most dense branches of needles to try to match the ones with the least amount of needles, but you don't go below a certain number. So we do that to redistribute energy. We also do post-flush hardened pruning. Again, after the tree's hardened off, we go in and remove foliage or needles. And partial defoliation is also another way of redistributing energy. The other way to redistribute energy is, I call it auxin manipulation. So a tree grows, most trees, auxin forms both in the root tips and in the tips of the branches, the ones that are highest in the tree, getting most of the sun. And auxin as a hormone basically will suppress the growth of branches below it. And if you will, take most of the energy up towards where it is growing, so it becomes a taller tree. So obviously we could cut it off if we wanted to redistribute the energy. The other thing, if you want to leave all the wood on and get, either keep it as a branch and also keep as much wood on to thicken up the tree as much as possible, you can just merely take that vertical growing branch and lay it out in a horizontal fashion. And what will happen is the auxin flows out of the tip, cytokinin moves into the branch, and buds will begin to form on that branch. The other goal would be with our energy is to reduce energy. And how do we do that? We can either not fertilize at times throughout the year, or do a low fertilizer, which is either a small amount or less frequently. And we do that when we decandle our Japanese black pines. Often we stop fertilizing them after we've cut off the first candles, because we've built them up to put some energy in. We let those candles grow wild. Now we cut it off. And now the next growth that's going to come out, since fertilizer increases needle length and we don't want to increase needle length, we don't fertilize after that time, and hopefully we'll get shorter needles. And that has worked for me, although sometimes the needles are actually, I've got to keep working on my fertilization because the needles came out too short. Partial defoliation is a way of also reducing energy. And again, try to approximately get 70% defoliation, otherwise you won't encourage new leaves to grow. Finally, placing the tree in a smaller pot reduces the amount of energy and pushes the system. So the tree is genetically set up to become bigger and reproduce, and it gives preference to top growth. So bonsai practitioners manipulate energy by pruning, by pinching, partial defoliation, needle plucking, shoot selection. We fertilize. How much do we fertilize? And how often do we do it? Wiring bending branches redistributes energy. We place the tree on benches with sun exposure consideration, and also we choose the size of pot impacts that. What are the major insults we do at a tree? A severe repot would be a major insult. Only do one of those a season. Major styling, lots of branches lost and foliage lost, only one time a season. Again, these are only occurring when the tree is in energy positive and showing real vigorous growth, and the time of the year is good. Doing major bends, again, which Terry's going to be doing a demonstration on next Thursday, damages the tree. So make sure that is considered a major insult. And if you did a wedge cut, for instance, on a pine tree where you're trying to take a trunk and bend it, where you cut out 50% of a wedge and try to pull those things together, that would be considered a major insult. So the 3 conditions necessary to perform surgery: A, the tree's got to be in an energy positive state, and you know that when it's sustaining and adding. Its metabolic activity is high, and it's a time of the year where the tree can compartmentalize and heal. And finally, there's sufficient daylight length and time before a hard freeze for the tree to reestablish itself for you to do any of these operations. And that's generally in spring as buds are swelling, and about midsummer for the second time. So some points to remember: turn the trees to give them sun exposure. Place trees in directions to ensure weak branches get southern exposure. Again, only one major insult in a season. Often it's only one a year, depending on how the tree recovers. Fertilizer is not a fix or a solution. It's supplemental and is used strategically to increase or decrease energy accumulation, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Do you want to increase or decrease energy accumulation? And you got to make that determination by what the tree is communicating to you and what your history is with that tree. And assuming the tree has sufficient sun, a healthy balance of oxygen and water in the roots is the tree's most critical requirement. Again, fertilizer is a bonus in a healthy tree that's recovered and has root surgery. Manage energy thoughtfully, and you'll be able to create aesthetically pleasing forms. I want to do one more. This is almost done. Peter Warren, he's a physics major, and he has a physics analogy, and I'm going to do a dancing analogy since that's one of my hobbies. And one of the things you often hear is let the tree guide the dance. And in some ways, what I was talking about in terms of energy, you have to know what the tree is capable of handling before you just apply techniques just because you want to and you have time to do it. So in dancing, it involves nonverbal communication with your partners. The old rules were the male leads and the female follows. The new rules are the partners take turns leading and following. And so with the tree, what's the tree's recent history or growth and fertilization? What's the health of the root system and the canopy? How well is it growing? Is it an energy positive, energy negative? What's the tree doing at this time of the year? Does it have time to recover? What is the species nuances? And so I've given you the guidelines of how a tree is reacting, but each tree and each species has nuances that you have to take into account when you work with those trees. So you're ready to let the dance begin. And at that, I'm going to, I think, stop the share. I think that's what I need to do, right? Yeah. Okay. And now, if you've asked questions, I assume they're in the chat, and Doug will ask them, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Sure. And Mike, do you mind putting your camera on?
Oh, I forgot to do that. Thanks. How do I do? Oh, there it is. There it is.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I happen to be the first one to ask a question. So you had said that new foliage is more efficient than old foliage. Do you know why that is?
My understanding, it's not unlike a windshield, that when it's brand new, it's crystal clear, you can see through it, and then over the course of time, it gets scraped up, dust, wind blown, torn, etc. So basically, it's like, I guess, new solar panels. Yeah, it's able to absorb it just because it's fresh, new, and clean, and it's not worn out yet.
Gotcha. All right, next one. And if I miss your question, I'll try to go through them in order, but if I miss one, let me know. So next question was from Hunter. He was asking, when you were talking about what goes on during the winter, whether you recommend using fertilizer in the winter.
No, because first of all, it's probably you're just wasting it. Even though a tree's metabolically active, it's not pulling in a whole lot of energy. It may be actually absorbing some water. But no, I wouldn't recommend it. One, because it's not helpful, and B, it functions as a salt. I don't know, if you've ever spread fertilizer on your yard and accidentally dumped a little bit on a grass spot and come back a little bit later and found it completely brown and burned out. What happens is it functions as a salt and it will pull water right out of the grass. So if you put fertilizer in your root ball and the tree's not active, it's going to sit there and want to pull water right out of the actual cells of the root to balance the gradient, and that's how solutions work. Things balance each other out, and that salt will pull water out of the roots. So there's two. Yeah, it's one, it's not useful, and two, it could potentially hurt the tree.
Louise asked if a tree loses its buds due to winter freeze in the spring, can you still repot that tree?
Ooh, that's a good question. If it lost, well, let me think about that. If it lost its buds, well, I guess it depends on what kind of tree we're talking about. And again, I'm sort of thinking out loud. If it's a conifer, it's in trouble because basically that's its new solar panels. And if there are no new buds, or very few of them or whatever, that tree is going to have to rely on its old needles. So I would probably not, as I'm thinking, I would probably not repot that tree. I guess if on a deciduous tree, if it were really healthy, I'm thinking deciduous trees have lots and lots of dormant buds on them anyway. So if it's a tree, I don't know, like an elm or things like that, where somehow they got knocked off or whatever, I would think that the tree probably has the capacity to push growth into those dormant buds, especially if it's a thinner barked tree. If it's a cork bark tree, that's another problem. I guess if in doubt and it really didn't need to be repotted, I probably wouldn't repot it. And if I had to repot it, I would probably try to make it a mild repot where I didn't remove tremendous amounts of roots.
I had another question or a request for elaboration. At one point you wrote, trees don't need fertilizer. And I think probably most of us know what you mean, but I thought it might be useful for any beginners who might see this as a video later, if you could elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, again, trees primarily, the nutrients that we give a tree allow it to photosynthesize, and the tree will basically photosynthesize. And if you think about trees growing out in the mountains in rock pockets with minimal amounts of minimal amounts of nutrients, minimal amounts of soil or whatever, in other words, the tree will survive. And if we're going, and so I'm probably exaggerating it. Yes, it does need some of those things, obviously, to continue to do that, but it's not like we're never going to fertilize the tree. So if you don't fertilize that tree for a whole year post repot or whatever, the tree will do fine. It won't grow necessarily a lot or whatever, but it'll probably do fine. So I guess I was slightly over exaggerating the point. Yes, they do need nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus, but probably not nearly the amounts that we give them. And a tree can survive a long time without them. And so to err on the side of under fertilizing initially after a repot makes a whole lot more sense than the over fertilizing.
That leads in well to Hunter's next question, which is, what are some signs that it is safe to fertilize after repotting?
Well, again, at least 4 to 6 weeks for those the wounds of the roots to compartmentalize and heal and start generating. The other thing you should start seeing, and again, this is the statement I made, is the tree maintaining what it already has on it? So, and obviously if it's a deciduous tree, it can't be maintaining anything because there wasn't anything on it in the first place. But say a pine tree or a conifer, are all of the needles and all of the scale continuing to stay on? Now, the other thing we're going to look at then, say for a pine tree as an example, we're going to look at the candles. When those candles start to elongate, and we have a history of knowing that tree, are they elongating to the same length that they've always elongated to? Or are they bigger? Are they a lot smaller? Are they all tiny? So if those candles come out and they're shorter than typical and maybe small and they put on a little extra growth, that's telling me the root system hasn't recovered greatly, and it can't add a whole lot to more than what it's already got. So that's what you're going to look for. So if you see, and if you have a history with the tree and you know that the shoots come out and they typically are 2 inches long and they're coming out, 2 inches long again, you're going to say, wow, this tree not only can it sustain what it had, but now it's added. Those roots must be in good condition to be able to add foliage.
Great. I had a question about energy management with respect to pinching or pruning. So for example, on an elm, they can grow these long shoots with many sets of leaves on them. And my understanding is that you should let them grow and then cut them back, but you could also pinch them. So what are the differences between those two approaches, especially with respect to energy management?
That's a good question. They're similar and they're different. Obviously, it depends on the size of the elm, what I might do. For instance, if I have a small leafed elm already, I'm going to probably allow it to elongate and cut it back to 2, elongate and cut it back to 2, just because it's easier. Actually, I probably do that on my bigger elms as well. I tend to let them elongate 4 to 6 leaves to harden off and cut them back. So I don't tend to do a lot of pinching on elms. Again, they have alternate buds, and typically they tend to form them. I do tend to pinch more on Japanese maples, trident maples, American maples, because they have what's the word I want to say? Parallel leaves. They come out at the exact same place. Opposite. And that way if I'm pinching them, when those 2 leaves come out and the new one comes out of this, new stem comes out of the center, I pinch it off. Those 2 buds on either side tend to push out a new one, which now I've just bifurcated it. So they have similar properties. I would assume when you're pinching and it's really tiny, you're not losing a whole lot of energy right away because you've pinched those leaves just as they're coming out. You're losing a little bit, and then it forces it to go in the buds right at the base of that or further back into the tree. Where when you allow the tree to elongate and then cut, you probably didn't initially push back that energy, but at the same time when you allowed it to elongate, you're allowing it to increase some energy. So there's similarities, but like I said, I tend to use the pruning method with the more alternating leaves, and I tend to use the pinching method with the like maples and the ones that have parallel buds.
Mm-hmm. Another one from me. Do you know much about how fast water moves from the pot to the leaves for various tree species? And this is especially with regard to managing energy and growth during the hottest part of the summer.
That's an excellent question. I could tell you in general. I don't know how. There've been some studies where they put a chemical and trace how long it takes for the water to carry it up through the tips. And it can be incredibly slow in some species. For instance, pines, like a ponderosa pine or whatever, they have very slow water mobility. Whereas a Japanese maple, they go up very quickly. Now, I can't tell you whether it's hours or days or anything like that, but basically high water mobility trees like a Japanese maple or some of our larches and things like that, they move much more quickly. And actually, and this is not related, approximately 75% of water usage of a tree is for cooling purposes. It merely is allowing the tree to sweat and lose its heat. And the 25%, if you will, is used for photosynthesis.
Great. Okay, that's it. Except Larry challenged you to say something regarding oxen 3 times fast. There was some phrase that was a tongue twister. But that's all the questions we had from the chat.
Oxen manipulation.
Oxen manipulation 3 times quickly. I just did it.
Oh, nice answer.
Okay, if that's it, just a little advertisement. We have our meeting Thursday.
Maybe stop the recording at this point.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Again, how do I do the recording?